Boldwood presents The Seaside Girls, written by Tracy Baines and read by Julie Maisie. Chapter 1. Norfolk, Whitsun Bank Holiday Weekend, Saturday the 27th of May, 1939. The house was a pressure cooker, Aunt Iris the lid, pushing down on them all. Jessie looked at the mantel clock. It clicked round. Another minute. How long could a person last without air? 5 minutes? She recalled that even the great Harry Houdini had not been able to hold his breath for more than 4 minutes. She longed for escape, wondering how these interminable afternoons didn't bother her mum, who was absorbed in her needlework. Grace Delaney had settled herself in the high-back chair to get the best of the light as she worked, her elegant posture the only lasting trace of her former life as a ballerina. The grey streaks in her auburn hair turned to silver as the sun streamed into the sitting room that overlooked the front garden. The last few years of worry and sorrow had left their mark, and although her mum never complained, they were etched in every line of her fine-boned face. Jessie got up and went to the window, slid the sash open as gently as she could. The slightest noise, and Iris would descend on them, migraine or not. "Don't, Jessie. You know your aunt dislikes the windows being opened in here." Jessie bit at her cheek. "There isn't much she does like, Mum." How on earth Uncle Norman got lumbered with such a harridan was beyond comprehension. Her mum's only surviving cousin, he'd welcomed them into his childless home when Jessie's dad had died, but it was blatantly clear that Iris found the Delaney family's arrival a great imposition, disrupting her regimented and antiseptic world. They shouldn't have come, wouldn't have, if only her mum had been a little stronger in health. Living here these past 8 months had changed them all, and not for the better. Eddie, her 14-year-old brother, was at school most of the time, but even he had become subdued. The imposing Victorian villa stood at the edge of a small village a few miles from Uncle Norman's solicitor's practice in the busy market town of Holt, a house of great luxury compared to the shabby little houses and rooms her parents had had over the years. Living at the Beeches had made her realise that there was more to happiness and comfort than expensive furnishings and an inside lavatory. Jessie paused. "Just a few minutes, Mum," she said, turning to face her. "Don't do anything annoying, love. We mustn't upset her." Her mum gave a small, hacking cough and resumed her embroidery. Jessie watched her elegant fingers move, her needle glinting as it pierced the cream linen tablecloth. It would be one of the many her mum had worked on since they'd come to live here. She'd planned to take in dressmaking work to support her family, but Iris had been aghast that Norman's relatives could even consider bringing trade to the house. It was bad enough that they were connected to the music hall. And so, increasingly, they were trapped, fashioned to the life Norman and Iris Cole wanted for them. Jessie had been manipulated into taking a secretarial position at Norman's office, for which she was entirely unsuited. She was suddenly overwhelmed with resentment for the way in which her mum had resigned herself to life here. But what else could they have done? Her parents' lives had been lived on the stage, touring in shows, taking rooms when the long productions ended, and her dad had been ill so many times before that it was a shock to them all when he died. She and Eddie had grown used to the periods of darkness that overcame their father, the melancholy, the drinking, the weakness in his chest that Mum explained was from the effects of the Great War. Dad's failing health meant that he became unreliable, and bookings dwindled to nothing. In the end, they shared 2 small rooms in a dilapidated house in the back streets of Derby, and her father gave music lessons while her mum took in sewing. They didn't have much, but they were together, and that was all that mattered. Jessie leaned out of the window, feeling the breeze on her skin. The scent of lilac blossom, warmed by the afternoon sun, hung in the air, and Blue Tits darted through the shrubs in search of a meal. Her heart ached for things to be as they once were. When all the debts had been settled after her dad's death, they'd been left with nothing. She wanted to be angry with him for leaving them to this silent, colourless hell, but she couldn't. She gripped at the sill. She should have kept singing. Then they needn't be here, because she'd have kept a roof over their heads, she was sure of it. Her mother had given up because she was tired, but she'd get better, and Jessie would find work she loved. They both would. She was 18 now. She could strike out on her own. Hope stirred inside her. There must be a way to escape this miserable existence. "Close the window, Jessie, please," her mum urged. Jessie eased the sash down, but not quite closed, and looked again at the clock. Almost 4. Almost time for her aunt to terminate her nap and descend on them. Her pinched face certain to turn the milk sour at tea. She paced around the room. Why did everything have to be brown? The heavy drapes at the window, the walls, the floor, brown and insipid, colourless, just like her aunt, exactly like their life. Jessie walked to the rosewood piano, pulled out the stool. "Not yet, Jessie dear, we don't want to disturb your aunt." Her mum's voice held a hint of firmness this time, but Jessie had had enough. What was the worst that could happen? Sharp words? Angry silences? It would be worth it. She lifted the lid. "I won't play anything lively. A little Debussy, almost a lullaby. You know how you love it." She flexed her fingers, wanting to bring some light into her grieving mum's life, and placed her fingertips gently on the keys. 4 o'clock was the rule, and as the clock chimed the hour, she began to play. In moments, she was transported by the music, sensing her mum's panic fade, and the thought of Iris's disapproval dilute and disappear. Her mum set her sewing in her lap, rested her head on the back of the chair, and Jessie was gratified to see a smile play on her mum's lips. Music was a blessing, her dad's gift, and now hers. She closed her eyes as she played, her mood changing. What was it? Happiness? Joy? There was movement upstairs, and she ignored it, wanting the music to fill her up, only stopping when she felt her mum's hand on her arm. "Shh, my love." Iris was in the doorway, her hands pressed to her ears, a pained expression upon her long white face, her dark hair a sharp contrast. "What a hideous noise, Jessica. You know quite well that I have a migraine." Her mum's grip on her arm tightened. Jessie's hand covered hers. For a fleeting second, mother and daughter looked at one another. Jessie gave her aunt the sweetest smile she could muster. "It was after 4, Aunt. I thought you'd be awake." "I was awake, but that's hardly the point." With a final squeeze of Jessie's arm, her mum hurried to Iris's side. It was in that moment that Jessie saw the lengths her mum was willing to go to keep the peace, if it gave security to her family. "Could I get you a glass of water, Iris? Would that help? You might be dehydrated," her mum whispered, and Jessie's throat thickened to see her mum so submissive to this woman. Jessie closed the piano lid carefully and twisted herself around on the stool. "I'll get it, Mum. You sit down." She slipped out of the room and returned with a glass of water, noticing that the window had been closed completely. Well, the old cow was strong enough to do that, Jessie thought, as she handed Iris the glass. Her aunt took it and sipped at the water, while her mum stood in attendance. Jessie hovered close by. Iris waved her hand as if to brush them away like specks of dirt. "Do sit down, Grace," Iris's voice was sharp, "and take this nonsense away." She pointed at the embroidery. Jessie caught the look of pain on her mum's face and clenched her fists as Grace picked up her needlework, chose another chair, and, head down, continued with her delicate silk roses. Iris sipped at her water. The clock ticked, and the air became stale again. Jessie began to play imaginary piano on her thighs, finishing the tune she had been prevented from completing. Iris fixed her with a beady eye. Jessie carried on, relishing the effect her silent playing had. "You are too wilful by half, young lady," Iris snapped. Her mum looked up. "You may have turned the head of young Harry, but if he has any sense he won't marry you. What sort of mime would—" She picked up minute fibres on her brown skirt, then brushed them away with the flat of her hand. "Any young man worth his salt wants a wife to be proud of, unless, of course, you'd be satisfied with a man of lesser opportunities." She tilted her head to one side, peering down her sharp nose at Jessie, dark eyes narrowed. It was an ill-concealed dig at her dad. Jessie folded her arms across her chest. Dad was kind and loving, and had the sweetest soul. She saw her mum tense. Iris sniffed. "A musician who—" Her mum's voice was steady. "He was a very fine musician, Iris, classically trained before the war." Iris wafted a hand. "Before the war was a long time ago, Grace. He had a good start, but to end up in the halls, playing variety—" Iris shook her head, smiling condescendingly at Jessie. "There's nothing wrong with variety," Jessie spat. "It gives pleasure to lots of people. It makes them happy." Although what would Iris know of happiness? Her aunt snorted with derision, and Jessie felt the heat rise to her face and neck, her ears burning. She must think of her mum. She mustn't rise to Iris's bait. Given half the chance, I'd be on the stage now, singing, dancing. "Ah!" Iris huffed in satisfaction. "Making an exhibition of yourself? You don't need to be on the stage to do that, madam." Jessie was all set to slice Iris apart with her tongue when the sound of tyres coming up the drive stopped her. Uncle Norman was home. He at least brought a little relief with him. When they'd first moved to the Beeches, Jessie had wondered at the long hours he worked in his legal practice, but it didn't take long for her to understand why. His weekends were taken up with golf and pottering about on the small boat he kept moored on the river. Eddie had been encouraged both to caddy and to crew, and she envied the relationship he was slowly building with the older man. Why couldn't Iris have done the same with her? The woman had taken an instant dislike to Jessie and reminded her from the off that they were not blood relatives, and she was aunt in name only. The lines had been drawn, and Jessie had been glad of it. She sat quite still and waited, hearing the car door slam shut. Then another. Voices. Another engine stilled, another door opened and shut. "Harry!" Jessie leapt to her feet and rushed from the drawing room, ignoring her aunt's disapproving looks, but hearing her snap, "That girl!" Her uncle was already in the hall, resplendent in +4s, removing his tweed cap and hanging it on the hook in the hallway, then smoothing a large hand over his bald head. Through the open door, she saw Eddie wrangling Norman's golf clubs from the boot of the Ford before taking them to the garage. Harry's royal blue Austin was parked to the rear, and here he was, carefully wiping his shoes on the doormat to save a reprimand from his boss, Uncle Norman. She moved close to him. How wonderful to see him so unexpectedly. His face was flushed, his thick, sandy hair damp at his neck, and when he smiled at her, his blue eyes glittered with amusement. "They're not dirty," he whispered, "but I'm not taking any chances." "That will do, Harry. Come in," Uncle Norman ordered. "Where's your aunt, Jessie? We have news to share." Jessie gestured to the drawing room. Eddie joined Harry and they loitered in the hall, but Jessie followed her uncle, unwilling to leave her mum alone. Uncle Norman kissed Iris on her raised cheek. "Did you have your lie down? Did you rest?" Iris adjusted herself in the chair. "I tried. Unfortunately, Jessica played the piano rather too loudly and I awoke with a start. My migraine." She let out a breathy sigh. "I'll be all right in a little while." Her tone was frail and weak, the voice she used for Norman, not the voice she used to pierce Grace and Jessie. Oh, she was clever. Jessie had to give her that. Norman looked at Jessie. Not in reprimand, she thought. More a weariness that she had added to his burden. She hung her head. Norman turned to her mum, his voice soft. You seem so much brighter today, my dear. I do believe this country air is doing you good. He patted her hand, and Grace summoned a weak smile. Harry, Norman called into the hall, let's share our good news, young man. Harry entered the room, and Norman slapped him on the back. Ladies, allow me to introduce the new junior partner of Cole's solicitors, Mr. Harry Newman. Harry didn't look at him, but at Jessie, and smiled proudly. But there was something else in his eyes, and Jessie sensed his recognition that his life too was directed by the Coles. Before Jessie could speak, her mum got up and hurried to take his hand in both of hers. Oh, well done, Harry, she said. Good news at a time like this, with the world so dreadfully tense. Norman nodded his agreement. Indeed, Grace, but we must carry on as normal until Mr. Chamberlain tells us otherwise. As Grace moved aside, Jessie stepped forward and hugged Harry. She heard Iris tut at such an outward display of affection, which made her want to hug him more. He held her close. Sweet darling Jessie, he whispered into her hair. She gripped his hand, squeezed it, then let it drop. As Grace has already said, congratulations, Harry. I'm sure you will prove to be an asset to my husband's well-respected practice. Let's hope Jessie will handle the increasing workload. She looked piercingly at Jessie, her hands folded in her lap. There would be no handshake for Harry from that quarter. Harry smiled. I will endeavour to repay your husband's confidence in me, he said, tipping his head in a little bow. Jessie hated to hear him being so subservient, but of course he had to be. There was no one else to share his good news with other than his landlady. No doubt he would write to his father and stepmother in Singapore, but would he get a reply? And his investment, Iris added, eager to labour the point. Harry's smile became fixed as he looked from Norman to Iris. Of course, I will always be grateful for the opportunity and faith you and Mr. Cole have shown to me. I know quite well that at 22 I am fortunate indeed. Jessie sighed loudly, and her mum shot her a look before returning to her chair. Grateful. The very word set her teeth on edge. Eddie sidled into the room and stood behind the sofa, his brown hands stark against the white antimacassar. The sleeves of his blue shirt were rolled back to the elbows, and he was burned from the sun out on the golf course, where he'd been caddying for his uncle. His wavy brown hair, the same colour as Jessie's, was sticking up at the front, and he ran a hand over it in an attempt to tame it. He, at least, seemed able to shrug off the atmosphere of the house and wend his way, heedless of it all. Now, Iris, Harry has more than earned his good fortune, Norman said, stepping in to smooth the way, something Jessie had noticed he did quite often for Harry. Eddie is a long way off being able to step up, and it is only sensible to have this wonderful young man on board. Another pat on the back, and he gestured for Harry to sit down on the sofa. Jessie sat back on the piano stool and dug her nails into her hands. Eddie's life already mapped out for him, and hers too, as a typist. Tea was quickly served by Nellie, a girl from the village who helped about the house. Nellie put the tray down on the oak side table with a bang, turned, winked at Jessie, and slammed the door shut behind her. Jessie got up and poured the tea, Eddie wordlessly slipping beside her, taking the plate of ham sandwiches and offering them round. He grinned at Jessie when he returned, and she handed him the jug of milk, their silent unity calming her. Norman settled on the sofa with Harry and chatted about the golf game, his best shots, his worst. Of course, Harry here let me win. Harry nearly choked on his tea. I did no such thing, Mr. Cole. It just wasn't my day. Norman, please, no more Mr. Cole. We're partners, remember? He leaned across to Jessie. He's a fine golfer, Jessie, A fine young man all round, don't you think? Jessie nodded. She'd known from the start he'd be a bright, shining star in this miserable existence. He'd been so kind to her when she started pounding the typewriter at Coles. A few weeks later, they'd started walking out together, a match that met with Norman's approval. Jessie guessed he was considering the future of the firm rather than her happiness, but that didn't matter. She loved being with him, but enough to spend the rest of their life together? She sipped at her tea, then placed it on the small table to her left. Norman sank back into the cushions of the sofa, his hands folded across his ample stomach. I think you youngsters should go out and celebrate Harry's good news, don't you? It was an instruction, not a suggestion, and Jessie snatched a look at Harry. She saw the relief on his face and leapt to her feet. But what about Eddie? She turned, but Eddie shook his head. I said I'd clean Uncle Norman's golf clubs this evening. I can do yours too, Harry, if that helps. He winked at Harry. Clearly the two boys had arranged this. It would be just the two of them then. Jessie wound down the window of the Austin before Harry had put the car into gear. It was wonderful to be going somewhere, anywhere. She'd never sat down as much as she had these past months. She could feel her muscles slackening and was becoming increasingly restless from being indoors so much. The days of dance and movement, of music and colour seemed further away every day, but she told herself that her dreams of a singing career were merely interrupted. Harry reversed out of the drive and headed towards the main road, whistling to himself and grinning at her. She grinned back, but her head was full of what she had lost. Her singing had been paused, but her dad was lost to her forever. A surge of sadness made her chest tighten, and it was hard to breathe, harder still to bear, and yet she knew she must suppress her grief, because her mum could not shoulder anything more than she did already. She shouldn't have snapped at Iris. It only made things worse for all of them. Harry turned left at the crossroads and out of the village. Where to, Miss Delaney? Jessie took the pins from her hair and shook it about her shoulders. The copper tones of her brown hair caught the late afternoon sun, and she felt the chains of the Cole household fall away. It's your celebration, Harry. You choose. I'd rather you did. I think you'll choose something far more exciting than I would. Think of it as a reward for your afternoon of penance. She turned and smiled at him. His eyes were steady on the road ahead as it snaked through the burgeoning hedgerow on either side of them. She tipped her head back and rested her neck on the cool leather of the seat. They could go for a walk, but then Harry might be tired of walking after the golf course. The coast was not too far away, and they both loved the seaside. Let's go into Cromer and see a show, she said at last. There's bound to be something on the pier. The thought of it made her half laugh with anticipation, and she turned suddenly, put her hands either side of the window, and leaned out as far as she could. The breeze blew at her hair and whipped it across her face. Opening her mouth wide, she gulped in the cold air as the car rushed along. She tilted her head back to let her hair flow behind her until she felt Harry's arms on hers. Get in, you crazy fool. She pulled in, liking the feel of his hand because it was gentle. He wasn't ordering, he was protecting her. As she settled back into her seat, his hand returned to the steering wheel. Jessie squealed when she caught her first glimpse of the sea as they approached the outskirts of the popular seaside resort. It was a distance of less than 10 miles, but a whole world away from life with Iris. They drove down towards the seafront, and Jessie was thrilled to see the swarms of people out enjoying themselves, in spite of the news from the continent. Italy had aligned itself with Germany, the two bullies committing to support each other if it came to war with France and Britain, and Hitler had made clear his intentions to move in on Poland. War seemed inevitable, but there was still a sense of hope. Harry braked the car to a halt outside one of the large hotels. She got out and pulled her cardigan about her shoulders. The seaside air smelled of fish and chips and candy floss, sweet and salty. Harry took her hand and led her to the wider esplanade. She caught sight of the pier in the distance. the white and grey of the pavilion appearing like a palace out on the sea. People surged down towards the beach, and noises of laughter and squeals of delight mingled with the sound of merry-go-rounds and bangs and whistles from the kiosks that lined the promenade. Donkeys plodded along the golden sands, the bells on their halters jangling as they moved, and children raced down to the waterline, splashing each other and skipping over the gentle waves that lapped the shore. They strolled past carts selling fresh chroma crab, cockles and mussels. "Fancy some," Harry said, catching her hand. She nodded, smiling, and suddenly the misery of the beaches felt 1,000,000 miles away. Harry queued, she beside him, and they ate vinegary cockles from a paper cone as they walked, then idled, looking at postcards, trying on straw hats, posing for a photograph that would be sent on to them. The sun was still warm as it began its slow descent in the sky, and she felt as free as the gulls that wheeled and screeched above them as they headed towards the pier. 2 round kiosks stood either side of the entrance, and even from a distance she could see the crowds milling along the length of it and down towards the pavilion. As they got closer, she saw the house full board had been put outside the pier entrance. She let go of Harry's hand. Her pace slowed. He sensed her disappointment. "Hey, grumpy face, let me ask. They might have 1 seat left at least." She laughed as he walked over to the box office and watched as he bent his head to speak to the girl at the window. She studied the poster at the pier entrance, hoping that when she turned, he would be holding tickets. But when he came and stood beside her, she knew he hadn't been successful. "I'm sorry, Jessie, both houses are sold out. The girls said they'd never been so busy." She looked longingly up at the pier as people came and went. "Perhaps everyone feels that this is the last summer we will know before war, and are taking every grasp at happiness they can. I know the feeling. All this will we, won't we is driving everyone ruddy crazy. It's the uncertainty of it all." He struck out with his heel. It was her turn to cheer him up. "It's not your fault. We can still walk along the pier. It's a lovely evening." They strolled along at an easy pace, stopping at intervals, leaning on the railings, staring down onto the beach. Children were building sandcastles or digging holes, and she pointed at 2 little boys who were burying their father in the sand, his toes and head the only parts of him visible. Out on the sea, sailboats tacked through the water. "Do you think there will be a war?" she said, shaking her head at the cigarette he offered her from his case. The breeze snatched at the lighter flame, so he cupped it, inhaled, exhaled, and dropped the lighter back into his pocket, only then replying, leaning on the railings again. "It's beginning to seem more likely. I don't think Mr. Chamberlain's so confident these days. It's a pretty poor mess." "What will you do, Harry? Will you sign up, or will you wait?" "Hey, slow down," he murmured. "You've got me fighting for my country, and I haven't even had 1 day as junior partner at Coles." She laughed. "I'm sorry. I forgot. It's your celebration. You've done ever so well, and you'll be good. I know you will. Just don't become like him, for goodness sake." Harry shook his head. "Not much chance of that with you in the picture." She grinned, flattered, and he reached for her hand. "Come on, Miss Delaney. Let's keep walking, not thinking." "But it's the time to think, isn't it?" He took one last drag on his cigarette and rubbed it out under his foot, taking her hand and walking along. "Jessie, life needs some security while things are as they are. Your uncle is good to work for. He knows his stuff, and I'm learning such a lot. Soon I'll have something to offer." He stopped, kissed her hand. Her heart twisted. He looked into her eyes and smiled. They said nothing, just stood there as others passed either side. "What I'm trying to say is that soon I'll have something to offer you other than life with a fumbling trainee solicitor who doesn't know his arse from his elbow." She laughed and looked away, over his shoulder at the sea, the clouds floating across the sky, seagulls soaring far out over the water. She knew what he was trying to say in his own clumsy way, but it was far too soon to get so serious. She loved him, of course she did, but was she in love? because that was something different. She just wanted to be with him, holding his hand, walking and laughing, for there was so much life left to live, so much she needed to do for her family. She turned to look at him, his dear face, his blue eyes so earnest, then back at the theatre. "Well?" he asked. She reached up and touched his face. "I'm not sure what I want, dearest Harry. The only thing I know is that you are my anchor in this crazy world." He gripped her hand, kissing it. "Then let's see if we can find one of those spivs with a ticket tucked up his sleeve." He hurried her along the promenade. In an alley at the side of a cafe, a fat man with oily hair leaned against the wall. "Looking for tickets, Gov?" "Meet your fairy godmother, Jessie," he grinned. "Yes, let's have a couple. My girlfriend's happiness depends on it." Chapter 2. Harry grabbed her hand and pulled her along the parade, the pair of them laughing as they went. "Come on, slow coach, or we'll miss the opening." She could barely keep up as he weaved through the crowds and headed for the pier. Something wonderful was happening, a slice of her old life brought into the new. They reached the pier and Jessie stopped to catch her breath, her hand to her heart, her chest pounding with exhilaration. "You shouldn't have paid so much," she berated him as her breathing steadied, secretly pleased he had, that her happiness meant that much to him. "You must be out of your mind." He grinned. "Maybe I am, but it was worth every exorbitant shilling to see your face." She stayed close to him as they walked up the pier, their footsteps clattering on the wooden planks as they headed for the pavilion on the end of the pier. "Thank you so much, Harry," she said again. "I can't tell you how excited I am." "Tell me later," he smiled, cupping her chin and tilting her head up towards him, kissing her lightly on the mouth. "We'll have all the time in the world after the show." The queue was already forming for the second house and they got in line, Harry holding the tickets in one hand, hers in the other. He laughed at her. "You chump. If you keep smiling like that, your face will ache like merry hell in the morning." The man in front of them turned around. "Yes, love, I'd pace yourself if I was you. From what I've heard, the comedian's a corker." "I don't care," Jessie said. "I want to laugh until my head falls off." No, miss. Nothing so drastic, if you please," he said, putting out a warning hand. The plump woman beside him turned her head and smiled good-naturedly at the two of them. "It's grand to get out and have a laugh, lovey. Make the best of things while we still can." Jessie nodded her agreement. She stared out over the pier and watched people milling along the esplanade. Little lights had begun to appear on the stalls that were dotted along the promenade, selling candy floss and rock. The woman's words were jolting in her head. "While we still can." She turned back to Harry and tried to catch up with the conversation. It seemed everyone was chipping in with their twopenn'orth. "I shouldn't think the shows will go on much longer," the plump woman said, her voice wistful. "Nah, this ruddy government don't like any of us to have fun," someone behind them chimed in. "It'll be the first thing the blighters do." The others around them laughed, but Jessie couldn't bear to think of it. "They won't stop the shows," she said, quite adamant. "If it does come to war, we'll need to keep our spirits up. We have to, don't we?" she said, soliciting opinions from either side. The laughter had subsided now, and the conversation took a heavier tone. The first man considered it. "I'm sure you're right, miss. But I shouldn't think they'll let the peers stand, not as they are. It's almost an invitation to Jerry to step right up and help himself." Jessie's face tightened in a frown. Close the shows? The whole country silenced of music? Wouldn't Irish just love that? A wave of hopelessness swept over her. Harry shook at her hand. "I can see your point about the peers," he said with a nod to the chap, "but I can see Jessie's too." He smiled at her. "We'll all need to keep our chins up, won't we?" Jessie looked up at him, her eyes shining. He believed in her and it warmed her heart. "We will, young man. We'll need something to keep us all going." "Ah, love's young dream." The chap nudged his wife as the queue began to move again. "Ain't it great? You hang on to him, lass. He's fighting your corner good and proper. Jessie gripped Harry's hand tightly. I will, she said, feeling her cheeks redden. Harry fighting for her was one thing. To think of him out fighting in uniform was something else entirely. It changed everything. Dad had never been the same again. Mum said war had ruined him, the man he was. His hearing was damaged by the shells, so he couldn't hear his beloved music with clarity, and he'd developed tremors, so much so that at times he couldn't play. It was the reason he drank, to calm himself, nothing more. She didn't want Harry to change, and she wasn't going to think about the war or anything else for that matter. When she walked into the theatre, she would forget everything. Wasn't that what Dad had said theatre was all about? Forgetting and remembering, and both at the same time. The queue surged forwards, and as they neared the double entrance doors, her shoulders tensed with delight. Harry bought a programme from the petite usherette with chipped red nails who tore their tickets and handed the halves back to him. Down the centre aisle and on your left, she instructed, before turning quickly to the next person in the queue. Jessie hurried towards their row. Harry, amused by her eagerness. She pushed down her seat, hardly able to believe she was here when just a few hours ago she'd been gasping for air. Happy, he said, sitting down beside her. Delirious. She leaned over and planted another kiss on his cheek. It was so good to be in a theatre, to be where she belonged. Her heart was beating hard with excitement as she drank in the deep red interior, the plush luxury of the stage curtains, the glow of the lights overhead. All around them, people were taking their seats, a constant wave, up and down as they shuffled into place. Little pillars of cigarette smoke rose up about them, and a low cloud floated in the still air. They barely had time to look at the programme before the usherettes drew the curtains over the doors and the lights were dimmed. The babble of the audience became a hush as the orchestra began the overture. Jessie shuddered with delight as the ruby curtains drew back with a swish to reveal 8 dancers gliding across the stage to embraceable you. 4 tall, handsome men in evening suits led 4 leggy girls across the stage, sweeping them into their arms, the girls' shapely thighs showing through the splits in the skirts of their diaphanous pink dresses. When the number came to an end, there was a polite ripple of applause. The inner gold curtains came across, and the compere, smart in his black suit, half ran, half skipped to centre stage. He took the microphone in his hand and beamed at the audience. Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, welcome to Cromer Pier. Have you all come to enjoy yourselves? There were a few mumbled yeses from parts of the audience. The man put his hand to his ear. I can't hear you. Have you come to enjoy yourselves? This time, everyone shouted yes in unison, then burst into laughter. Jessie looked at Harry. His face was glowing with happiness, and she knew it was partly because he was enjoying himself, but mostly because he had made her happy. That's better, the compere roared. Let's get on with the show. Put your hands together in a big warm welcome for Mr. Magic himself, the Great Valdini. The Great Valdini wore top hat and tails and began by pushing up his cuffs, opening his fingers wide and turning his hands back and forth in time to the music so that the audience could see that he had nothing up his sleeves. He produced cards from thin air, or so it seemed, and deftly weaved them between his flexible fingers, dropping them onto a small table to the side of him. The audience applauded politely. They're not warmed up yet, Jessie whispered to Harry. It's always tough being first on. Harry took her hand. Ever happened to you? Frequently. She wished that she was up there now, first on or not. She knew she would conquer her nerves once the music began. It was always the same. The churning stomach, the hesitation, but once the music played and she stepped out into the light, everything fell away. While Harry queued for ices at the interval, Jessie read the programme, poring over every detail and working out what she would use to describe her own act when she took to the stage again. because sitting here she knew she would. It was important to entertain, to lift people away from their worries and troubles. Harry handed her an ice cream slice, and she put the programme on her lap, folded the wrapper into neat squares and placed it in the ashtray on the back of the seat in front of her. "We should do this more often." Harry settled back in his seat. "Yes, we should," Jessie agreed as the lights came down for the second half. How could she explain to him the sense of completeness she experienced, not only when she was watching, but when she was the one up there, performing, singing as if her heart would burst with the pure pleasure of it? Would he understand? It was soon time for the top of the bill, and the mood in the theatre changed to one of high anticipation. There was a reprise of the overture, and the ruby curtains opened once more to reveal a recreation of a starlit night on the Italian Riviera. Daphne Shearer appeared, centre stage, and walked to the front. Tall male dancers in evening dress, one either side, holding her hands. She blew them both an exaggerated kiss as they left her, came to the microphone, and began to sing Love for Sale. The audience was with her from the beginning, and remained so until the end, as she sang old favourites and songs that they heard on the wireless. Jessie drank in every movement, the way Daphne held the notes, the way she moved across the stage and leaned towards the audience, drawing them in, and they held on to every note she sang. Jessie looked around her, at men and women who may have already accepted that their loved ones would be going off to war, some for the second time. They'd left their worries behind them for that magical hour and were swaying along to familiar tunes. When Daphne finished with Thanks for the Memory, the seats clattered as the audience rose as one to applaud her, their programmes slipping to the floor. Jessie and Harry leapt to their feet along with them, grinning at one another. Then Harry leaned over and kissed her mouth. "I'm so glad you're happy," he said against her lips. "I can't tell you how much, dear, darling Harry." The applause rang on, and she knew that this was what she must do. Make people happy, and not just people, but her own family. They had to get away from Aunt Iris and Uncle Norman and the endless, dreary Brown. When the show ended, they filtered out onto the pier, the voices drifting in the night air, full of excitement. Lights were shining from the Hotel de Paris in front of them, high up on the cliff top, and couples sat cuddling in the ornate Victorian shelters on either side of the walkway. The ropes of lights along the pier swayed a little in the breeze, and the surf rushed across the shingle. Harry put his arm around her, and she nestled close to him. "Cold?" "Only on the outside," she whispered, leaning her head on his shoulder. "Dad said that one of the greatest gifts was to be able to entertain," she murmured. "It takes people out of their lives." Harry slowed. "That sounds serious, as though you're thinking of yourself. Are you? Is life that bad?" She had no idea how to answer him. What if he told her uncle how she felt? But would he? Her Harry? For a moment she wasn't sure. "Oh, Harry, if there's to be war—" He stared, worried. She saw her dad so damaged by war and his friends who had not returned. She looked at those passing them, talking of the show. It all seemed so fragile, and Harry most of all. War was surely coming. Everything they held dear would be threatened by a war no one wanted, and yet one couldn't stand by and let things happen. She must do something. She owed it to her dad, to Harry, to all of those people walking along under swaying lights. She shivered and leaned into him as people passed by, heading for their boarding houses or dashing to catch the last bus. Yes, she must do something, no matter what Iris and her uncle thought, no matter how many obstacles they put in her way. In the car on the way back, she started to sing Little White Lies. "You have a wonderful voice," Harry said, taking his eyes off the road for a moment to look at her. "Sing with me," she said. "We could do a duet. Jeanette MacDonald and Nelson Eddy. She began to sing, Will You Remember? I'd rather listen to you, Harry said, changing gear as they reached a crossroads. They idled there, waiting for a bus to pass before Harry could turn right. Jessie sang, purposely overdramatic, holding her hands across her heart, a forlorn expression on her face. Idiot, he said, laughing. He stopped at the bottom of the drive to the beaches, left the engine running and opened her door. Jessie leaned forward and started to sing On the Sunny Side of the Street, holding out her hand, urging him to take up his hat and coat and leave his worries behind. He took her hand in his and eased her out of the car. Shh, you'll wake everyone up. She looked at the house. A lamp was lit in the drawing room, the glow from the bay window at the front so welcoming. She turned to Harry, her eyes sparkling. Mum will be waiting to hear all about our evening. We always waited for Dad to come home. It was such a special time. She looked towards the window again. Her mum and Eddie would want a blow-by-blow account. She would sing some of the songs, of her yearnings to do the same. But that would only happen if they had gone to bed. At the thought, her joy began to seep away, continuing even when Harry pulled her close and kissed her, his mouth warm against hers, his hand in the small of her back. What I said earlier about wanting to look after you, he whispered. She pulled away from him, holding on to his hands, not wanting him to go on, to ask. It was too soon to have an answer for such a question. They'd only been courting a few short months. His face was half in shadow, for there was barely a moon that night. The leaves of the oak and beech were rustling in the breeze, and in the distance a vixen shrieked. Jessie heard the front door open and saw Eddie silhouetted in the doorway, the light from the halls spilling out onto the path. I'd better let you go. He released her hands and got into his car, almost whispering, One day I'll marry you, Jessie Delaney. One day, but only when you're ready. In the meantime, be happy, my little songbird. It's been the most wonderful night. Thank you, Harry, she called in a low voice, watching him drive away, feeling relief, and then the return of her joy because Harry had said to be happy. She almost danced up the path, holding her skirt, swaying along to the tunes that were returning thick and fast as Eddie stood back to let her in, closing the door quietly behind them. As she swayed into the drawing room, she hesitated, seeing no smile on her mum's face, and her eyes flashed a warning. Instantly, Jessie fell silent and sought Iris, who must still be in the drawing room. And there she was, stony-faced in the high-backed chair, her glasses on the end of her nose. Without looking up, Iris closed the book she'd been reading, put it on the side table, removed her spectacles and placed them on top. I hope you're pleased with yourself, Jessica. Waking half the village with your noise. I can't for the life of me imagine what Harry was thinking of. Or perhaps he didn't know how to cope with such behaviour. Jessie steeled herself, wanting to shout out that he'd enjoyed every minute of the show and her singing, but she mustn't spoil his prospects or their opinion of him. Much better that they blamed her. It's Saturday, Aunt Iris, she replied calmly. There's no work tomorrow. And no sleep for some either, with you carrying on. Your poor mother is exhausted, waiting up for your return, and so am I after keeping her company. Grace remained silent, sadness in her eyes. Jessie held her tongue but fisted her hands with the effort. She wouldn't add to her mum's misery by responding to Iris as she ranted on and on. It was like being back at school again, pulled out in front of 4C while Miss Renshaw asked her why she hadn't completed her homework, only it was worse. Suddenly she felt her throat thicken. She wouldn't cry, ever, in front of this woman. Iris got to her feet and walked over to Jessie, leering into her, whispering hateful things, contorting her face. Such an ugly, bitter face it was, too. Jessie glanced down at Iris's hand, the palm flattened. Was she going to strike her? Let her dare. Jessie tensed her body and looked at her mum again, her eyes bright with fear, her hand at her throat. She mouthed, "Don't," and gave the slightest shake of her head. It was the smallest of movements, but enough to make Jessie reconsider, and she swallowed hard and forced herself to say, "I'm so sorry, Aunt Iris." Her mum's shoulders relaxed. "It was selfish and thoughtless of me," Jessie continued, making sure she looked suitably apologetic. "It was good of you to wait with Mum. Thank you." Did she sound sincere? She hoped so. Iris wasn't sure. Jessie could tell by her expression. "I'd better let you all get to bed. I'll turn everything off and lock up." It had taken the wind out of Iris's sails, and they both knew it. Eddie stifled a yawn, and Iris glared at him. "Let's hope we don't wake your Uncle Norman. He and Eddie are going out on the boat tomorrow, though what good Eddie will be to him is debatable. He's as tired as your mother and I, but he insisted on keeping us company. What a gentleman he is turning out to be." Eddie kept his head down, not wanting to invite comparison, and Jessie loved him for it. How could they carry on like this, afraid to be who they really were, slowly being shaped into the people Iris thought they should be? She felt a deeper anger and gritted her teeth. She apologised again, all the while wanting to scream at the old battle-axe. Iris swept out of the room, and Grace got up and rushed to Jessie's side, clasping her hands in hers, whispering, "Did you have a lovely time, darling?" "Wonderful, Mum," she said. "Harry tried everything to buy tickets for the show and kept on at it until he did." Grace smiled, her eyes twinkling in the dim light of the room. Iris called from the hall, "Are you coming to bed, Grace?" Grace kissed Jessie on the cheek and whispered to her, "Clearly, she's not so worried about waking Norman now, is she? Was that a foghorn we just heard?" She and Jessie shared a triumphant grin. So her mum was not beaten entirely, and while there was a glimmer of her old fire, there was hope. Grace brought her hand to her mouth and coughed, then put her arms out to hold Jessie close. As they hugged, Jessie felt Grace's shoulders sharp against her. "I'll tell you all about it in the morning," she said. Eddie moved to the corner and turned off the standard lamp. "I'll lock up, Jessie, you go to bed." He was almost as tall as she was now, and losing some of the gangly thinness that made him awkward. He was indeed growing into a fine young man. At least she and her aunt agreed on something. Jessie left the curtains open and lay on the bed, fully clothed, staring out at the moon and the stars. The three of them shouldn't have to suffer this silent house. Her mum deserved so much more than this. She thought of the people in the queue and felt herself slowly untangle, and as she stared at the moon she realised it was not just because she was in the privacy of her room, but because this evening had woken her from the stupor in which her dad's death had left them. Tonight had given her happiness because of Harry, but also because she had been in the world she loved, a world that could help the war and her family. She got up and went to the window, looking at the trees moving in the wind, the moon lighting up the garden. Would such a moon help the German planes? Would bombs drop? Would Harry go to war? She shook herself free of the questions. For now she had to concentrate on the possibilities that she could create herself. And what were they? She heard the call of an owl. Tomorrow she would write to Bernie Blackwood, her dad's old friend and agent. He'd have work and she would take anything at all to make her life worthwhile, her family free. And Harry? Oh, Harry, will you ask me again later? You see, I have work to do. It was only a whisper, but it was a promise too. Chapter 3. It had been almost a month, and no news, not even the briefest of notes from Bernie. Jessica had been certain that he would have got in touch, but as the days turned into weeks, she became more despondent. Her only consolation was that she'd kept it to herself. Even when she searched in the garage for her practice clothes and shoes, she had done so in the pretense of looking for a particular piece of music of her dad's. She'd found them at the bottom of a tea chest, one of 4 that were stacked along the back wall. Her shoes were worn, but they still fitted, and she had tapped out a little routine in the cool darkness of the garage, delight fluttering like a butterfly. What a fool she'd been to imagine that Bernie would remember her. She let out a long sigh, and as the church clock chimed 5, Miss Simmons, Uncle Norman's secretary, pulled the cover over her typewriter and signalled for Jessie to do the same. "Anything else will wait until tomorrow, Jessie." Jessie made a small pencil mark on the list of invoices on her desk, slid them inside a buff folder, and pushed her chair back. She didn't need to be told twice, only too glad that another day was over. Miss Simmons placed her neat handbag on her desk while she fetched her dark grey jacket and hat from the stand in the corner. It was Wednesday, Norman's half-day, when he would see clients until 11 before leaving for meetings with the Chamber of Commerce. Jessie had already taken the post and checked the waiting room was tidy, so there was little to do before they left. The main reception office where she worked with Miss Simmons was always in order, and it made it easy at the end of the day to simply get up and go. "Mr. Cole will no doubt be pleased with the progress you've made. When you apply yourself, you really are most efficient." Jessie closed the ledger on her desk and popped her pencil back into her pot. "I do try, even if I don't always succeed. But you will succeed. I can tell you have it in you. You're that sort of girl." Jessie walked over to the cabinet behind Miss Simmons' desk and stored her files, while Miss Simmons pulled on her jacket and secured her felt hat with a large pin. "I'm not sure whether that's a compliment or not," Jessie grinned, and Miss Simmons raised her eyebrows. She liked to tease now and again, and the old girl took it in good part. "While I appreciate your attempts at humour, it's best not to get in the habit of using it in the office. You might very well forget when there are clients present, and Mr. Cole would not be pleased." She took her gloves from her bag, snapping it shut. Jessie slipped her chair beneath her desk. "Bye, Miss Simmons. See you in the morning." "You will," she replied, slipping her bag over the crook of her arm and patting her hat into place with a free hand. "Have a pleasant afternoon." When she'd gone, Jessie pulled on her red jacket, flicking her hair out of her collar, and went to get Harry. She peered around the door to his room that was barely more than a cupboard, but a nod in the direction of his new status as junior partner. "Nose to the grindstone, Mr. Newman." His desk was covered with stacks of papers, and around him on the floor were more of the same. He continued to read, head down. "I have my mark to make, Miss Delaney, a crust to earn." Jessie leaned over his shoulder. "Looks like gobbledygook, but as long as you understand it." "I'd better, or the Messrs. Huntley will be the poorer for it." She took his jacket from the back of his chair